So in this Hatshepsut video, we'll be having a look at an overview of religious beliefs and practices during this time period. And this is important for us to understand because it helps us to understand what things were like when Hatshepsut came to power, when she came into her reign, what those practices and beliefs were, and also what she continued in her reign, and then what she added on to or innovated in her reign, which were continued by later pharaohs as well. This isn't going to be a holistic video about Egyptian religion. This is just a very brief overview and summary of some of the things that we need to understand. So we'll get started by having a look at the gods in ancient Egypt, and this is a really brief overview. We need to understand first and foremost that Egypt was a polytheistic society, which means that they had numerous gods which were represented in various ways and which had particular personal attributes and purposes for the Egyptian people. We'll look at those specifically when we look at religion and at different points when we look at Hatshepsut, and that's whenever they become relevant, that's when we'll look at those individual gods. We won't have a big overview of who those gods are now. The main god we will have a look at is Amun-Ra, who is the state deity or the state god during this time period. And again, we mentioned before that this was a composite god of the god Amun, who was from Thebes and had been worshipped there since early times, which is where these Theban kings were from, who established the new kingdom in the 18th dynasty, and a composite of him and Ra, who was the sun god or the solar god, but often just represented as the man Amun, or the personality of Amun as a man, rather than recognizing or rather than seeing a solar disk as well. So when we see Amun, this is what he looks like for us. So important to remember, he is a state god, and the majority of the worship is centered around worship of Amun, but not solely. The next thing we need to understand is temples in this time period, and there were a number of temples, but this is by far the most significant one. This is the temple complex, which is at Karnak, which is just outside of Thebes, which is where the capital of the New Kingdom period was. This was where the sanctuary of Amun was kept, and a number of other temples and sanctuaries for various gods, very much focused on the god Amun. And Hatshepsut had a number of innovations and a number of building projects in the Karnak temple complex, which we need to understand and learn about through this time period. One of which was pylons. Hatshepsut was responsible for one of these pylons. The pylons, as you can see on the right hand side there, that long cylindrical object, their purpose was to keep chaos at bay, which was again the opposite of Ma'at. Ma'at represented order and balance, and these pylons, their purpose was to keep chaos at bay. So that was the purpose in building them. They also formed what we'd call a gateway, so they provided a direction for a procession during a religious ceremony or a festival. We also have sanctuaries, and we have the sanctuary of Amun at the temple at Karnak, the temple complex at Karnak, and that is where the statue, the image of the god, was housed. And you can see here that at certain festivals that statue would be taken out, the representation of Amun would be taken out and processed on what's called a bark, not B-A-R-K, but B-A-R-Q-U-E. And we can see an image of one up here. I'll use the cursor. You can see a boat-like shape here. It's kind of like a boat, but carried by people in a procession, and we see that in a number of different festivals, which we'll mention in a minute. Finally, we have obelisks, which are very much tall, quarried from sandstone pyramidion type structures, which had inscriptions on them. Hatshepsut quarried 4 of these, and we'll look at them more deeply when we look at her building program, but they represented the Ben mounds of the creation myth. So this was where Egypt was formed out of the void, out of chaos. Ben mound formed out of that, which is the creation story for the Egyptians, and that's represented by these obelisks. And finally, festivals. Festivals are a very important part of religious practice during this time period, and we'll look more at that when we look at religion itself. But Hatshepsut innovated in this particular area. She began the beautiful festival in the valley and the Opet festival, and you can see here another bark representation with the image of Amun being carried up here in the center. So there's a very brief overview of religious practices and beliefs during this time period.